Hello and welcome to A Friend Remembers Retrospective number 10 of the Final Fantasy series as we review all of the mainline entries with a short retrospective asking why you should play Final Fantasy X. The PlayStation 2 is one of the most famous and prolific and successful consoles in history. It followed the PlayStation 1 and dominated pretty much the entire gaming scenes for the early 2000s. And for the majority of its runtime, Final Fantasy X was the role-playing game that defined the genre. It was so bright and vibrant and successful, and there's a reason that it's the first game that got a fully fledged sequel within the Final Fantasy universe, something that has probably been overdone since, so that's one strike against it. But honestly, that might be the only one. I have so much love for this game, and I probably ought to declare my bias here. It was my first Final Fantasy experience. I think everyone who falls in love with this franchise is a bit nostalgic and a little bit biased towards their first game. So I have to declare that here. I'd never played a role-playing game outside of potentially, if you count The Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past and Link's Awakening as RPGs. Not everyone will, but I definitely never played a game like this before. A game where you weren't in direct control of your characters in the battle, you told them what to do, which is what all Final Fantasy games have been doing. But whereas pretty much since Final Fantasy 4 all the way up to 9 have been trying to bring timing and action, active commands, and a little bit more sense of engagement into the battle, Final Fantasy X brought it right the way back to tactics. This is a turn-based game, but it's not like Final Fantasy 1 to 3. The goal of Final Fantasy X is that there is a cooldown between your attacks. All the characters have different speeds, and depending upon their speed and depending upon the move that they're going to be taking and what the cooldown for that move is, they will have different turns. So every character in your battle party will have a certain number of turns, and the enemies will also have certain delays before their turn. So you have an attack, then another one of your characters have an attack, then an enemy will have an attack, and then another one of your party will attack. And this back and forth dominates the gameplay of Final Fantasy X. You can heal as you go through the battles, but it's often not very productive to do so. So one of the main strategies for this game is to try and delay the enemy's turns, or take them out, or buff your characters up to prevent you taking damage in the first place. It's honestly not a very difficult game once you've started to appreciate and figure out its strategy. In fact, for the first quarter of the game, this is possibly the easiest game in the series. Wakka, a character who throws a football as his main form of attack, is perfectly suited to taking out flying enemies. Your main character has a very high speed stat, so he can move very quickly and he's good for taking out wolves and other enemies with high agility. You have a very defined black mage. Lulu can take out enemy flans, which are magic-based creatures that are resistant to physical attacks. And you will recruit other characters such as Auron, who carries a heavy sword which is perfect for breaking armor, and so he can deal with armored foes. Yuna is your default white mage and healer, and also summoner. You can completely change the pace of the battles by bringing an optional strong beast into the battle to fight alongside you. I say alongside you, it pretty much replaces your party, and you can control this massive behemoth to dish a large value attacks against the enemies, but probably not have much defensive stats where you do it. The great thing about the summons though is they can die and your party will just come back in and resume the battle where you left off. All of these characters, although they have very defined roles, are interchangeable. You can swap them in and out of the battle at any time, so unlike all the previous games in the series, you're not confined to the team you set out with. You don't have to swap and change your roster at regular save points. If you want a character, if you realise at any point in time, I need a magic wielder to deal some damage to this particular enemy, you can bring Lulu in as long as she's not been knocked unconscious. Lulu's always available. If you need healing, Yuna's always available. It makes you have an instant connection with these characters. Their personalities are intrinsically connected to their jobs and their roles in the storyline. It all fits together beautifully, but it's not holding you to a straitjacket. By the end of the game, almost every character will have access to any other ability elsewhere in the character list. There's no such thing as defined levels in this game. You don't level up conventionally like every other Final Fantasy up to this point. Instead, just as it follows the law of the storyline, where characters can record events and memories into spheres, you power your characters up by gaining these spheres and moving along a grid. Now each of your characters will have a defined area of the grid that defines their skill sets. As I said, the main character is quite fast. He's good for taking on agile and speedy enemies that can avoid the attacks. But if you really just love being a black mage, you can wander over into their part and start leveling up the abilities and the attacks to give multiple characters black magic spells. You'll need to work harder because everyone who isn't Lulu isn't naturally attuned to it. They're going to have a weakness, a barrier that will take more work to get them up to the level she's working at. But if you want 2 black mages in your party, it's perfectly possible. If you want everyone to be a healer, Yuna isn't the only one constricted to having healing spells, but what comes naturally to her will require an awful lot of work for the other characters. There are only a few very hard lines that can't be broken across this game. Yuna is the only summoner. That's inviolate, you can't get around it. But pretty much anything else, put the time in. You can get your characters where you want them. What this means is that Final Fantasy X is the most customizable of games in the series. You can have any character learn any skill that you want if you put the work and the effort in. Or on the other hand, just go with the flow, follow the sphere grid, take the linear path and use the characters as they're intended to, and the game will still offer very little resistance until you're over the halfway mark. But it's that second half of the game, once you're used to the combat system, that the strategy really comes together. There's some really inventive enemy designs here. It uses status effects and the turn-based combat system to do some really interesting puzzle challenges. I've not felt a boss battle feel this strategy orientated since Final Fantasy V. However, outside of the combat system, Final Fantasy X is the most linear game in the series so far. It's not the most linear game in the franchise, we'll come to that pretty shortly, but there's definitely an accusation that Final Fantasy X feels like you're just following a path. It's not a completely straight path, and it is broken up by cities and towns and shops and interesting places for you to visit along the way, so you're not just eternally walking down a straight road, but large portions of this game will be you following the road. There are paths in the road where you can turn left and then circle back and then turn right, so it's not just a straight path. There'll be some side routes that you need to go down, and right at the end of the game you'll unlock the ability to travel to a range of other places that have been hidden that are not on the straight path. The game even opens up with genuinely exciting endgame content that asks you to revisit almost everywhere you've been on your journey and capture monsters or find hidden treasure chests that you would have missed the first playthrough. So there's backtracking here, there's revisiting old areas and finding new secrets along the way. I didn't feel that this constrained the character though. Truthfully, none of the Final Fantasy games are as open world as they make you feel. Although they give you access to an overworld to explore, the earlier games were all pretty linear in terms of where you needed to go to advance the story. Only Final Fantasy V and the latter half of Final Fantasy VI touch upon that brief moment where they can truly be called open world, but even then for the majority of the game, you're very directed and very controlled. Often with the downside that you spend minutes at a time wandering on the map, wondering where you're meant to go because the game doesn't give clear directions. Final Fantasy X dumps the overworld. You're always in control of these characters in a place where they feel scale. There's no weird aversion or graphical manipulations of sprite arts or malformed characters that just look out of place. This game was designed to use the power of the PlayStation 2 to present something that looked and felt authentic. Yes, the characters' faces definitely come from the console generation that they're on, so when the game developers really wanted to show emotion, they resorted to full motion video graphics and pre-rendered cutscenes, with the downside that the artist doing these cutscenes clearly had a different idea about the design of these characters to the in-game designers, because there's a major mismatch between the design of Tidus, Riku and Yuna in the cutscenes compared to the actual gameplay. This is a compromise I think is worthwhile though, because there really is only a very limited amount of emotion that the character models from this gameplay generation are allowed to display, and this game would not work if it wasn't capable of showing emotion. Having replayed the Final Fantasy franchise pretty much in its entirety, I can say there is no better told love story than this one. But it's not just a love story, it's an adventure, travelling strange lands, where the main character misplaced from another world and he's trying to find his way back home. It's a mystery about a dark secret hidden at the centre of the society that runs this world, that doesn't want to face the truth or let its populace know what's really going on. It's a contemplation on death and missing your loved ones. All these themes Final Fantasy has seen before. I'm just particularly enamoured with the way this one ties it all together. There's an argument about whose story this is. You will follow one character from the start of the game to the finish, but ultimately it's not his journey. it's Yuna's. You join this summoner on a pilgrimage as she sets out to defeat Sin, an eternal beast that has been stalking the land of Spira, wreaking devastation and chaos in his wake. You don't really understand who Yuna is, you don't really understand this world, you're a stranger in a strange land. But as you travel, you get emotionally connected to Yuna and Waka and Lulu, and Sir Auron, the man who brought you to this place and knows something about what's going on. Riku, the girl who rescued you when you first arrived, but comes from a persecuted group of people. This group are not a very large cast of characters, but all of them will take you through this journey. Even the silent Kimahri, who barely says a word until the last third of the game, has a deep emotional arc and connection to the other characters about why he's there, why he's following Yuna on this journey. Because it's so important to them, and it's so important to the world of Spira that she embarks on this pilgrimage, that she travels to Zanarkand to fight Sin. The revelations that come along the way, they're all teased, they're all paced perfectly, but they're shocking, and they come with emotional, heart-wrenching twists at the end of the game. The writing is not perfect. I can largely put this down to the translation errors. The cast, I think, are perfectly placed for their roles, but there are some oddities in the way that I think they're told to try and time certain lines to match the Japanese script that mean that sometimes the main character will say something very quickly or very slowly to try and pace the line to a certain way that just feels completely unnatural. It's definitely a product of the early 2000s. This is the first voiced game in the series, and you can see the growing pains. You can see the lack of sophistication in the way that the script was put together and that the lines were inserted into the game very matter-of-factly with little direction and polish around them. I'm capable of overlooking that, however. I can see the intent and the meaning behind the delivery. As I said, the voices themselves are perfectly fine. It's definitely an issue with the direction. So at the end of the game, when Tidus declared for the final time, this is my story and it will go the way I want it or I'll end it here, I was fully on board. I'm not going to record a double-length video like I did for Final Fantasy VII because I think Final Fantasy X speaks for itself. It changed so much, but it threw away so little. The overworld is the only true great loss, but I didn't feel it harshly. And what I got in return for that, for the tight direction, was something that was expertly paced. Yes, I had very little control about the direction my characters were going in, but that suits the storyline this game was telling. And what I got in return was a combat system that was ultimately customizable, allowed me to play this game however I wanted to, as long as I put the work into it. But that work never felt like a chore. And by the end of the game, you can make your characters so fast that you can give yourself 5 or 6 or 7 or even 10 goes, casting haste on yourself and buffing your characters up before the enemy will even have a chance to strike against you. You'd assume by that point of the game it's broken, it's not fun anymore, but no, I'm having the time of my life. Final Fantasy X, on a single playthrough, I can put as much as 80 or 90 hours into it and never feel bored. There are some mini-games that are absolutely appalling though, and after the worst excesses of Final Fantasy IX, the directors just haven't learnt when to pull back and when to realise this is a bad insertion into the game. Blocking off some of the celestial weapons, the ultimate weapons for certain characters, behind these mini-games is an unforgivable act. But the soundtrack, the music, just pulls me back in. I got married and had my first dance with the theme song of this game playing in the background, and my partner didn't know the meaning of the song to Zanarkand. It probably isn't an appropriate song to shape your life to, but I've no regrets. This was always going to be one of the high points of this marathon, coming back to this game. It's not the only game in the series that I can see myself coming back to again and again. It's not perfect. You can't skip cutscenes on the console ports, which is particularly bad when certain bosses are just obnoxious in the way that they can instantly kill your party if you make a mistake, meaning that you have to reload a previous save point and watch an up to 5-minute long cutscene of characters talking before you have a chance to fight that boss again. And as much as I praise the customizability of the sphere grid, I've seen other people get completely turned off by how obtuse it is. It's a brilliant system. It's not as complicated as junctioning in Final Fantasy VIII was, but it does require just a little bit of explanation for people to get their head around it. Bear those 2 warnings in mind though, and you'll have an absolute delight with Final Fantasy X. It's the last game made before Squaresoft fundamentally changed their philosophy of the way they make games and who they are and what their intention are. It's the last game in the series where Nobuo Uematsu had a significant role in composing for the soundtrack. It's the last game that was directed by Sakaguchi, who was there to create the original game. From here on, we've got a period of experimentation, of wild change, of taking risks and fundamentally rewriting the definition of the franchise. But now I've been back and I've seen all of the earlier games, I can see that Final Fantasy X truly respects everything that came before, and it shows you can be different without disrespecting the goals of your audience. This game won't be for everyone. It's a little bit more slower, a little bit more considered than the games that came before it. It doesn't have as much fast-paced action, but you can play it at your speed, and that's something to be truly thankful for.